I knew something was wrong the moment I saw the shadows gathering outside my driveway. 3 strangers standing shoulder to shoulder, clipboards in hand, staring at my home like it was a crime scene. I hadn't broken any rules. I hadn't done anything except exist on my own property. But the HOA had decided I was a problem, and they were determined to make an example out of me. What started as a quiet morning turned into a moment that made my stomach drop, because when I opened that door, I realized this was a simple visit. This was a warning. And the real question was, how far were they willing to go next? Before everything spiraled into chaos. Life in the neighborhood was almost painfully ordinary. The kind of place where people waved out habit, trimmed their lawns out of obligation, and pretended the air smelled like harmony even when everyone secretly kept score. It was a community built on polite smiles and unspoken rules, the kind that seemed harmless until someone decided to enforce them with a little too much enthusiasm. I moved there thinking it would finally bring a sense of calm. The house wasn't big or fancy, but had a quiet charm. The sort of charm you only appreciate after years of noise, deadlines, and neighbors who argued loud enough to shake walls. For the first few weeks, it felt like peace at last. I could drink coffee on the porch, watch the sun stretch over the rooftops, and let my guard down in a way I hadn't in a long time. The residents all carried the same veneer of friendliness. The couple across the street sent a welcome basket. The elderly man next door offered gardening tips. Even the kids playing in the cul-de-sac would wave each afternoon as they chased each other on bikes. Everything looked so normal, maybe even too normal. But at the time, I didn't realize that what I was seeing wasn't friendliness. It was surveillance wrapped in the illusion of community. And watching over it all was the HOA. Everyone spoke about the HOA with a strange mix of respect and fear, the way you might talk about storm clouds gathering on the horizon. They had rules for everything. Trash cans, mailbox shapes, paint shades, the number of plants allowed in a flower bed, even how long a car could sit in a driveway without moving. The handbook read less like guidelines and more like a warning. But I brushed it off. After all, I wasn't planning to cause trouble. I just wanted to live quietly. Still, there were signs, small ones at first, that something wasn't quite right. It started with a notice tucked neatly into my doorframe. A friendly reminder about the acceptable height of porch lights. Mine was apparently 1 inch too tall. Then another notice arrived about the placement of my recycling bin. Then a note about a non-compliant decorative item on my porch, which was actually just a potted fern I'd had for years. I told myself these were minor things. Annoying, yes, but not worth getting worked up about. Every community has rules. Every HOA has sticklers. Maybe they were just doing their job. But there was a pattern, one I couldn't ignore. Each notice was signed by the same board member, and each one seemed to come just hours after I stepped outside or rearranged something on my porch. It felt as if someone watched my home more closely than anyone else's, like they were waiting, searching, eager for even the smallest misstep. That uneasy feeling grew stronger the day I saw her for the first time. She stood across the street, arms folded, staring at my house with the kind of intensity people usually reserve for traffic accidents or burning buildings. A clipboard hung at her side, and her expression was carved into a permanent scowl. The other neighbors whispered her name with caution. Karen, the self-appointed guardian of the neighborhood and the HOA board's most relentless enforcer. She wasn't just committed to the rules. She lived for them. Every lawn height discrepancy, every porch decoration, every vehicle parked an inch off-center. She hunted them like trophies. I'd heard rumors that she once fined a family for leaving a garden hose coiled the wrong direction. Another rumor claimed she measured driveways with a tape measure to make sure everyone's cars were perfectly aligned. At first, I didn't think I'd be worth her attention. I was new, quiet, inoffensive. But Karen had a way of selecting her targets, and once she chose you, there was no escaping her gaze. Looking back, the first rail warning came the morning she paced along the sidewalk in front of my home, jotting notes, muttering to herself as she traced the property line like she was conducting an investigation. She didn't look at me. She didn't smile. She simply scribbled something onto her clipboard and marched away. In that moment, a strange chill settled over me, because even though nothing had officially happened yet, I could feel it coming. The conflict, the intrusion, the moment where a simple community rule would turn into something far bigger, far pettier, and far more personal than I ever imagined. I just didn't know then how far she'd push it, or how much worse it was going to get. The first real wave of trouble came quietly, disguised as nothing more than a thin white envelope taped to my door. I remember seeing it flutter in the wind as I pulled into the driveway, unaware of how dramatically it would shift the ground beneath my feet. Inside was a citation, my first official HOA fine. According to the notice, I had violated the community's aesthetic continuity rule by having a decorative item of unapproved color visible from the street. The item in question? My old potted fern. I stared at the paper in disbelief. The fine wasn't huge, but it wasn't the money that bothered me. It was the pettiness, the sheer absurdity. I'd lived in stricter neighborhoods before, but no one had ever fined me for a plant, and the wording felt intentionally vague, as if written to justify anything the HOA wanted control. I paid it anyway, not out of agreement, but because I thought it might keep the peace. But the peace was already gone. I just didn't know it yet. Over the next few days, more notices appeared, each one more trivial than the last. A warning about the reflectivity level of my mailbox number stickers. A complaint about my trash being placed 2 inches outside the designated zone. Another threatened fine for leaving my porch light on past acceptable hours, though no one seemed able to explain what those hours were. Every time I stepped outside, Karen seemed to materialize from thin air. She'd hover on the sidewalk, clipboard ready, eyes sharp enough to slice through glass. Sometimes she didn't even pretend to hide her scrutiny. She'd watch me arrange something on my porch, then immediately jot notes as if documenting a crime scene. It felt less like community oversight and more like a personal vendetta. I tried brushing it off until one Saturday morning, when I heard her speaking sharply to someone near my driveway. I stepped outside just in time to see her waving her clipboard while pointing at the faint tire marks on my concrete. Marks that appeared simply because it had rained the night before. She said the marks violated the HOA's driveway upkeep standards. I hadn't even known that was a rule. That was the first time I felt something shift inside me, a slow simmer of frustration that settled in my chest like a burning coal. But I still tried to stay calm. I still tried to be reasonable. That didn't matter, because the more I complied, the more she escalated. One afternoon, I came home to find a group of HOA board members gathered around my house, whispering as they inspected the perimeter. When they noticed me, they scattered, pretending it was some kind of routine check. Their awkward smiles told me everything I needed to know. Someone had called them. Someone had wanted them there. Someone was building a case. And there was only one person in the neighborhood who collected cases the way others collected hobbies. That night, I reviewed every rule in the HOA handbook. I expected to find some clarity, maybe a sense of fairness. Instead, what I found was a labyrinth of vague guidelines, loopholes, and clauses open to interpretation or misinterpretation. It became painfully obvious that the rules weren't meant to be followed. They were meant to be enforced. And whoever enforced them held all the power. For weeks, it felt like the air around my property thickened with tension. Every morning brought a new warning, a new complaint, a new threat of fine. And with each one, Karen's shadow over my life grew darker. But the real turning point came on a windy Thursday afternoon, the day I finally saw what she'd been doing behind the scenes. I was taking out my trash when I noticed her across the street, talking animatedly to a couple of neighbors. She gestured toward my house repeatedly, her voice rising and falling with the cadence of someone spinning a dramatic story. The neighbors occasionally glanced at me with uncertainty, nodding along to whatever version of reality she was crafting. I couldn't hear the words clearly, but I didn't need to. The message was written all over their faces. She wasn't just watching me. She was recruiting others to watch me, too. That night, I lay in bed feeling the weight of something I hadn't felt in years. Helplessness. Not the kind that comes from fear, but the kind that comes from being outnumbered, misrepresented, and silently judged by people you barely know. And it was only the beginning. A week later, I received a letter in the mail, not taped to my door this time, but sent officially from the HOA. Inside was a formal notice demanding corrective action for a list of violations supposedly found during a recent inspection. The list included things that sounded almost comical. Grass blades slightly uneven in height, insufficiently edged flower beds, a garage door described as visibly dusty. But at the bottom of the list, written in bold letters, was a final strike. Failure to comply will result in further enforcement measures. The phrase lingered in my mind, cold and ambiguous. I didn't know what further enforcement meant, but the tone suggested something far more serious than fines or warnings. I decided I needed answers. The next morning, I attended the HOA meeting, a cramped gathering in a stuffy room at the community center. The moment I walked in, conversations quieted. Eyes shifted. A few people looked away entirely. I sat down anyway, determined to stand up for myself. When it came time for residents to speak, I explained my concerns calmly. The excessive notices, the vague rules, the invasive inspections. I didn't mention Karen by name, but everyone knew who I was talking about. The room was silent when I finished. Then Karen spoke. She stood slowly, cleared her throat, and launched into a speech about community standards, property value protection, and residents who refused to cooperate. She never looked at me directly. She addressed the room as if I were a problem to be discussed, not a person. The board nodded along. Other residents murmured. I realized then that this wasn't a fair fight. It wasn't even a fight I was meant to win. It was a performance, and Karen had been preparing her audience long before I walked in. When the meeting ended, I stepped outside feeling drained but determined. I wouldn't let her bully me out of my own home. I wouldn't let her win. But she was already planning her next move. 2 days later, I woke up to find a bright orange notice stuck on my garage door, a final warning for unresolved violations. According to the letter, I had failed to correct multiple issues, even though nothing had been specified or explained thoroughly. And at the bottom was a line that made my stomach drop. The HOA reserves a right to take direct action if compliance is not achieved within 48 hours. What did direct action mean? No one could tell me. Every call to the HOA went unanswered. Every email bounced back with canned responses. I was being stonewalled. That's when strange things began happening around my property. One morning, I found my mailbox left open, even though I always shut it. Another day, I discovered footprints in the flower bed leading around the side of my house. A neighbor quietly mentioned seeing official-looking people walking near my backyard late at night with flashlights, though she didn't know who they were. And all the while, Karen watched, always from a distance, always with her clipboard, always with that faint, triumphant smirk. The final blow came late one evening as I was returning home from work. A white SUV sat parked near the curb, its engine running. Inside were two people wearing matching jackets with the HOA's logo. They didn't move as I approached. They just stared at me through the windshield, scribbling notes as if I were some kind of spectacle. My heart pounded as I stepped out of my car. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were waiting for me, recording me, building a file piece by piece. When I got inside, I locked the door and leaned against it, trying to steady my breath. I realized then that this wasn't just about rules anymore. It wasn't even about property. It was about control. And Karen had no intention of backing down. The next morning, as if fate wanted to push things even further, I found a new envelope, larger, heavier, and stamped with the HOA seal. Inside was something I never expected. A notice of mandatory inspection, scheduled to happen within the next 24 hours. They claimed they needed immediate access to my home and property, citing vague concerns about potential noncompliance issues. It wasn't a request. It was a demand. And there at the bottom, in bold letters, was a final line that made everything inside me tighten. If entry is refused, the HOA will take alternative measures. Alternative measures. The phrase echoed in my mind like a threat. For the first time, I felt something stronger than frustration, something deeper than anger. I felt fear. And yet, beneath the fear, something else began to rise. Something they didn't expect. Resolve. Because if they wanted a confrontation, they were about to get one. And it was going to change everything. The morning of the mandatory inspection felt unnaturally quiet. as if the whole neighborhood knew something was about to happen and was holding its breath. The sky hung low with gray clouds, the kind that seemed to press downward until the air felt heavy. I stood at my window, watching the street, waiting for whatever the HOA planned to throw at me next. Part of me still believed they'd send 1 or 2 board members, maybe Karen and her clipboard, armed with their usual smug confidence. But deep down, I knew this wasn't going to be routine. Not after all the warnings. Not after the late-night visits and the mounting pressure. No one threatens alternative measures unless they plan to use them. At exactly 9 a.m., a caravan of HOA vehicles rolled around the corner. White SUVs with the association's seal plastered on the doors. 4 of them. They drove slowly, deliberately, like a procession preparing for a raid. Neighbors emerged from their homes, pretended to check mail or tend their yards just so they could watch. The air buzzed with anticipation. And at the front of the pack, stepping out of the lead vehicle like she was the sheriff of a town she didn't own, was Karen. Her posture was stiff, commanding, and laced with triumph. She had brought backup this time. 2 men in matching jackets, and another board member who held a thick binder stuffed with paperwork. It looked like they came prepared for battle. I walked outside before they could reach my door. I didn't want them crossing onto my property without me present. My hands were steady, but my heartbeat thundered in my ears. Karen approached first. She didn't greet me. She didn't ask permission. She simply lifted a sheet of paper and announced, in a voice loud enough for all the watching neighbors to hear, that the HOA was here to conduct a full compliance inspection, citing their right under a clause buried deep in the handbook, one I had somehow missed. Except I hadn't missed it. I had spent the entire night before reading every line of that ridiculous document, memorizing it section by section, and I knew exactly what she was counting on. That intimidation would override the truth. I took a slow breath, keeping my voice steady. I told her the clause she referenced didn't apply to private interior property, only exterior safety concerns. The HOA had no right to enter my home, not without cause, not without legal authority. Her eyes narrowed, but she kept her smile, a practiced, insincere curve of her lips. She motioned to the men behind her. They stepped forward, each carrying equipment that looked far more official than anything the situation required. Clipboards, measuring tools, cameras. It felt like a stage performance meant to overwhelm me with numbers and authority. I repeated myself. No entry. Not today. That's when Karen revealed her real weapon. She held up a second document, one stamped, signed, and notarized, a supposed emergency compliance order approved by the HOA board, authorizing them to take action without homeowner consent due to credible reports of hazardous conditions. Neighbors murmured. Phones lifted to record. Hazardous conditions? They were staging a spectacle. My stomach twisted as I scanned the page. It looked official. Too official. But the more I read, the more I realized something. It wasn't legally binding. It wasn't a court order. It wasn't signed by any city or county authority. It was a self-issued document. Intimidation dressed as legality. I raised my voice enough for the gathering crowd. This isn't real authority, I said. This isn't legal. And you know it. Karen bristled, cheeks reddening. She motioned the men again, telling them to proceed. They stepped toward my porch, toward my home, as if she alone commanded the law. And that was the moment the pressure finally snapped. For weeks, they had pushed me, cornered me, targeted me, lied about me, and now they were trying to force their way into my home under a fabricated pretense. I stepped forward, blocking the entrance with a firmness that surprised even me. I told them that if they stepped 1 foot onto my property, I would consider it trespassing, and I would respond accordingly. Karen scoffed, lifting her chin like she was immune to consequences. You don't make the rules here, she said, but she never got the chance to finish her next sentence, because at that moment, the sound of tires grinding against pavement echoed from down the street. A dark SUV, sleek, unmarked, authoritative in a way the HOA vehicles could never mimic, pulled up behind their convoy. The neighbors quieted. Cameras rose higher. The door opened, and out stepped someone Karen absolutely did not expect. The county compliance officer. Not someone I had called in panic that morning. Someone I had called the day before, after reading every line of the HOA handbook, after realizing how far the board had already stretched their authority, after seeing footprints outside my home and flashlights sweeping my yard at night. I had filed a formal complaint, a real one, with evidence, with timestamps, with photos, with records of every false violation, every harassment tactic, every late-night intrusion, and they had taken it seriously. The officer approached calmly, badge visible, expression unreadable. He greeted me, then turned to the HOA group. His eyes landed on the men with cameras, the binder full of violations, and finally on Karen, whose confidence evaporated the moment she realized she no longer controlled the scene. He asked her for documentation, real documentation, legal grounds for the forced inspection she was attempting. She tried to hand him the self-issued emergency order, speaking with fast, clipped words that tripped over themselves in panic. The officer read the document slowly, too slowly for Karen's comfort. His eyebrows lifted. Then he looked at her the way a teacher looks at a child who has been caught forging a parent's signature. "This," he said, "is not legally authoritative. And conducting searches under the pretense of legal authority you don't possess is a serious issue. Very serious." Neighbors gasped. A few exchanged looks of disbelief. Karen tried to talk her way out of it. She stumbled through excuses, blaming anonymous reports, twisting rules to sound urgent. But every word made her sink deeper. The officer cut her off. He explained, clearly and firmly, that the HOA had no right to inspect private property without cause, no right to issue emergency mandates without municipal involvement, and absolutely no right to intimidate residents with fabricated legal documents. Then came the moment that shifted everything. The officer turned to her and asked, in front of everyone, "Did you authorize this?" Her mouth opened, closed, then open again, no words, just frantic searching for a way out. But the men behind her hesitated. The board member holding the binder froze. No one stepped forward to defend her. She was alone. And for the first time since she'd started her campaign against me, she looked small. The officer informed her that an investigation into the HOA's conduct would begin immediately, an investigation that could lead to fines, removal from the board, or even civil action depending on what they discovered. Karen's face went pale. The board members exchanged looks filled with dread. The neighbors, those who once watched silently from behind curtains, now whispered loudly enough for Karen to hear. The officer turned back to me, assuring me that I had the right to refuse entry and that the HOA had grossly overstepped. The HOA vehicles began pulling away one by one, their arrival as theatrical as their retreat. The men lowered their cameras. The binder disappeared under an arm. And Karen, visibly shaking, walked slowly back to the lead SUV, her footsteps uneven, her confidence shattered. But before she got inside, she turned back toward me. For a moment, her mask slipped completely. No authority, no bravado, just a bitter, burning hatred for someone she could no longer control. She didn't say a word. The officer stood beside me, arms crossed, watching her closely. And as I locked eyes with her across the street, a realization settled over me. This wasn't over. Not yet, but for the first time, the power had shifted. And what happened next would decide everything. The days following the confrontation were unlike anything I had ever experienced in a neighborhood. The whole community seemed to shift its axis overnight. What had once been a quiet tension humming beneath the surface erupted into open conversation. Some hushed, some bold, all circling around the same topic. The HOA's overreach and the spectacle Karen had created. For the first time, people approached me not with guarded looks, but with sympathy. A few apologized for not stepping in earlier. Others admitted they'd felt targeted by the HOA too, but had been too intimidated to speak up. It was strange to see their reactions now, almost as if Karen's downfall had given them permission to reclaim their voices. But beneath all that, the strongest feeling I sensed was relief. Relief that someone had finally stood up to her. Relief that her grip on the community might finally be slipping. Still, the aftermath wasn't peaceful. Not immediately. The county compliance investigation began the very next morning. They arrived with cameras, legal pads, and a professionalism that made the HOA's theatrics look even more absurd in hindsight. They took statements from residents. They collected documents. They reviewed the inspection attempt and the forged seeming emergency order. And they spoke to Karen. Whatever happened behind those closed doors, whatever was said or revealed, I didn't hear about directly, but the shift was obvious. She stayed inside her house for days, her once daily patrols noticeably absent. Her car remained parked in her driveway, unmoving, as if she no longer dared to face anyone outside her front door. It was during this time that the board members began distancing themselves from her. They quietly removed her name from upcoming committee meetings. They avoided mentioning her in emails. Some even reached out to residents individually, claiming they had no idea what she was doing. It wasn't hard to see the truth. They had benefited from her behavior, but now that it had blown up in their faces, they were scrambling to save themselves. While the investigation proceeded, I tried to reclaim my sense of normalcy. I cut the grass. I sat on my porch in the evenings. I took long walks around the neighborhood, no longer worried about being watched or reported for each step I took. But the shadow of what happened lingered, and the biggest question in my mind remained. What would come of Karen? Would she face consequences? Or would she slip quietly back into her position once the dust settled? I didn't have to wait long. 2 weeks after the confrontation, a letter appeared in every resident's mailbox. It wasn't from Karen. It wasn't from the usual board representative. It was from the county office handling the investigation. The letter outlined her findings in careful, precise language: misuse of HOA authority, attempts to enforce unauthorized inspections, falsified emergency documentation, and patterns of harassment supported by multiple testimonies. It was all laid bare, everything she had tried to hide behind the guise of community standards. And then came the line that everyone had been waiting for. Effective immediately, Karen was removed from her position on the HOA board. Her access to HOA records was revoked. Her inspection authority was terminated. Her actions were referred for legal review. The neighborhood buzzed for days. Whispers spilled across lawns like wildfire. People gathered at the community center steps just to talk about it. For once, the conversations weren't fueled by fear or frustration. They were fueled by relief, vindication, and the novelty of witnessing accountability in a community that had long operated without transparency. But the aftermath didn't end there, because with Karen gone, a vacuum formed. The board couldn't pretend everything was fine anymore. Residents demanded change, real change, and for the first time, their voices mattered. Meetings were attended by people who had never shown up before. Proposals were challenged. Rules were reviewed. The pressure from the county forced the board to rewrite entire sections of the handbook, removing vague language and limiting their power to fine or inspect without clear cause. A few of the most complacent board members resigned quietly, slipping out before they could be caught up in the fallout. New elections were held. Fresh faces stepped in, people who wanted to fix things, not control them. And slowly, the culture shifted. The neighborhood became lighter, friendlier, more human. Kids played outside again, without their parents worrying about noise complaints. People added decorations to their porches that had once been forbidden. Simple things like wind chimes, potted plants, or a seasonal wreath. The rigid atmosphere softened, and for the first time since moving in, I felt like the neighborhood was becoming what it had promised to be in the beginning. But the biggest impact came on a personal level, because standing up to the HOA wasn't just about fines or inspections. It wasn't even about Karen. It was about reclaiming something far more fundamental: my peace. For weeks, I had lived under constant surveillance, second-guessing every decision I made. I had walked on eggshells in my own home, fearing the next notice, the next accusation, the next intrusion. And now I could breathe again. I could take out my trash without worry. I could plant flowers without measuring them 3 times. I could exist, simply exist, without someone weaponizing the rules against me. And yet, I couldn't shake the deeper reflection that came afterward. How many people had gone through something similar? How many communities were ruled by individuals who let power twist their judgment? How many homeowners felt trapped in systems meant to protect them? The thought lingered with me long after the dust settled. One evening, as summer settled in and the days grew longer, I sat on my porch with a cold drink and watched the neighborhood glow in the orange evening light. Kids rode their bikes in circles around the cul-de-sac. A neighbor waved from across the street as he chatted with someone walking their dog. Life looked normal again, maybe even better than normal. Then I noticed movement across the road. Karen's front door opened slowly, and she stepped out for the first time in weeks. She didn't carry her clipboard. She didn't inspect anything. She simply walked to her mailbox, retrieved a stack of letters, and stood frozen for a moment as she scanned the street. She looked smaller now, like someone who had finally realized the limits of her power. Our eyes met for a brief second. There was no hate, no anger, just something tired in her expression, like she was coming to terms with the consequences she had brought upon herself. She turned back into her house without a word. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel pity. What I felt more than anything was closure. She no longer controlled anyone. Not me, not the neighborhood, not even herself. Months passed, and the neighborhood continued to rebuild. New rules, new leadership, and a renewed sense of belonging replaced the fear that had once seeped into every driveway and front lawn. The HOA wasn't perfect. No HOA ever is, but it became reasonable, fair, human. And as for me, I found myself growing roots in a place I once considered leaving. This house, this street, this small community. They became a part of my life in a way that felt stronger because of everything we'd gone through. Conflict has a strange way of either breaking people or bonding them. In this case, it did both, but it also redefined what it meant to live here. Looking back now, the lesson is painfully clear. Power only works when people are afraid to challenge it. And the moment someone finally stands up, really stands up, the entire balance can shift. It only took one confrontation to unravel years of unchecked authority. One refusal to be intimidated. One moment of clarity. And that's something every homeowner, every resident, every person living under an HOA should remember. You don't have to accept abuse just because someone claims to have the authority to dish it out. Because sometimes, standing your ground in the face of unfair rules or petty tyrants isn't just about protecting your property. It's about protecting your dignity. And the real question, the one I still think about, is this: if you were pushed the way I was, would you have stood your ground too?